the current setups are, the way that it currently works, it is hyper concentrated in, I think, 3 to 4 mining pools. It's been that way for a while.
EOS was raising funds like crazy, like nothing I had ever seen before that.
Is that the majority of the space in general thought that the ICO funds went to EOS, but that is not the case. The developers, the community, the people building on EOS, they didn't see that capital. They didn't see any of those funds.
Because like, I feel it's also important to make a few clarifications. First of all, Yves, thank you for agreeing to this and welcome to our podcast.
And, welcome. Thank you very much for having me on, George.
Yeah. And before we dive into EOS, the past, the present, the future, can you please give us some background info on yourself? Like, what were you doing before crypto?
Sure. So I came into crypto quite early. I started early on in 2010, approximately. 2010, 2011. And prior to that, I had been working in the federal government in Canada as a behavioral economist. That's more kind of the education side of things, or the professional business side of things. But really where this story starts for me anyways, is when I was really young. I started building computers when I was 6 years old, programming when I was 7. So I really fell in love with computers in general very, very early on, which led me to studies in software engineering, which then led me to eventually Bitcoin, which actually really started as protein folding in the very beginning, which didn't start off as Bitcoin, which then protein folding, this idea of pooling computational resources towards a greater goal. That's really was my door into Bitcoin. And then, yeah, the rest is kind of history from there. But I started in crypto very, very early on, left the space. I forget around what time, but I left the space essentially when the ant miners were yet to be released, had been pre-ordered, had not been shipped yet. And I recognized that this idea of decentralized computing from a personal level would cease to exist. That essentially me mining Bitcoin with my laptop was going to be a thing of the past. And that if you want to continue to meaningfully contribute to the network as an individual, you would not really be able to do so. That essentially mining pools would consecrate. Mining pools already existed at the time, but there was no central force. So sure, some people had more mining rigs or more computers, more video cards, etc. But there weren't warehouses full. It wasn't these massive installations that we have right now. So that's when I left, and I then came back full time in crypto in 2017, and really that's what led me to EOS.
Well, so obviously this talk will be centered around EOS, but you touched upon something interesting, and I just want to poke your brains. But do you think that the concentration of hash power, as you said, in like large mining facilities and companies, specifically for Bitcoin, is a problem? Because some would say it's a centralization issue. And
I think, well, yes and no. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So I think that the way the current setups are, the way that it currently works, it is hyper concentrated in, I think, 3 to 4 mining pools. It's been that way for a while. One of the advantages of that is that it's extremely expensive, or I guess one of the downsides of that, one of the realities of that is, in order to be able to compete at this point, you require so much capital investment. And that is part of the security, right? So to be able to overtake the network, you would have to put in so much money to, once you do that, this would be quite known, this would become apparent, and the network would have time to react and protect itself. And we've seen that Bitcoin has been quite secure because of that, fundamentally. One of the downside of this, though, is that as a new entrant, it's very difficult to be able to enter and meaningfully contribute to the network. So yes, it has hyper concentrated, but in those mining pools, they've got so much time and investment in the system that overtaking the system also doesn't make sense. It's this idea of, what's the concept again? This idea of killing your golden goose.
Yeah.
Right. So the system is built as such. I think it has quite a lot of value. I believe it, like anything else, it's got some pros and cons, but ultimately I believe it is more beneficial than not. even though it is concentrated, there's still the capacity to be able to shift hash rate around and for people to actually change mining pools, etc. We don't see that happen very frequently because there's not necessarily a need, but the possibility exists. And overall, what I believe the function of Bitcoin is in this overall ecosystem, I think it does it very, very well. So as a layer, as your kind of layer 0 or your first entry point into Web3 or into the blockchain space, Bitcoin does that extremely well. And you don't necessarily use Bitcoin for your application layer. You don't use it for your daily transactional layer. You do use it as the base. And I think for that, it does it very good. So I don't see it as much as a problem. But I do recognize that it is not decentralized in the way that originally was the idea, but inevitably things centralize to a certain extent, regardless. Those are, if you want free market forces, that this is something that reoccurs time and time again.
Yeah, although we're seeing lately that people are trying to push Bitcoin as an application layer with the Ordinals protocol and all that, which I assume could lead to entirely different discussions. So I'm gonna circle back and ask you, how did you end up in EOS?
So when I came back in a way to the blockchain space, it was in the, I guess, late 2016. Friends and I started looking at distributed ledger technologies again, and started looking at blockchain again, and formed a book club, something really simple. And we started reading about it again, getting re-involved again. And it was just perfect timing. 2017, obviously the ICO craze, this idea that the technology was at a point where there was enough lessons learned. The technology was at a point where it can now be used for more than simple transfers. Obviously, you had Ethereum, you had smart contracts. We saw the limitations in scalability there, but 2017 then really brought about this idea of Gen 3 layer 1 blockchains. So something that would inevitably open up in a way the floodgates of having this tech be able to reach mass adoption. That's what I thought at the time. Clearly, 6 years on, we still haven't reached mass adoption, but this idea was very much in the air at the time. And reviewing all of the projects, and in my life, I had the opportunity to kind of leave formal employment and to get back into the entrepreneurial side of things. I was looking at each project, and EOS is really the one that attracted me. It just had everything that I believed was necessary for this idea of a kind of an operating system or an application layer base protocol blockchain that could offer the scalability solutions that we were somewhat facing, or the issues that we were facing. And really, EOS was the first one that attracted me, with that having read everything. It had the previous tech with one of the founders having built 2 separate applications in the past, and now learning from that and trying to build a kind of an OS more. It had a lot of capital pouring in. It had a really good white paper with a worker proposal system, seemingly good incentivization for node operators, a good, I guess, blend or a good balance between centralization, decentralization, in order to be able to offer that performance. So everything was just right. The time was just timely. I thought it was just a really, really good opportunity, and I dove deep in right away.
I remember first starting to write about EOS in early 2018, or perhaps towards the middle of 2019. EOS was raising funds like crazy, like nothing I had ever seen before that. And there was this ad. I don't remember the guy's name, but he was a popular guy with the big cowboy hat, saying that EOS is going to change everything. And you said that it was positioned to. They had the funding, they had the tech, but what happened?
It's so funny that you remember one person with a hat. I know who you're referring to.
It was a very impactful ad.
Yeah,
I remember it it was very profound sounding, like, yeah, and that's why it stuck to me.
So the ICO did raise a little over $4.1 billion, which, to put it in perspective, eclipsed anything else. I think the second largest ICO at the time was around $150 million, if you discount, because then afterwards ton happened. But at the time, the second largest ICO was $150 million. And then this project raised for the founders in this private entity called Block.one raised a little over $4.1 billion. So it's just massive. And as part of the raise, they committed to redeploy back the majority of the funds back into the ecosystem. And then over a period of time, the majority of the funds became this idea that at least $1 billion would be redeployed back into the ecosystem. And so, as you mentioned, and as I said before, the tech potential was there. The marketing clearly had an impact on you, and it had an impact on the majority of people in this space. I mean, to have raised $4.1 billion when your second closest competitor is 150 million, marketing-wise, you're clearly doing something very well. Your reach is extreme. And so there was a lot of expectations around this ecosystem. And unfortunately, part of what occurred is that those commitments and those promises of redeploying the capital back into the ecosystem never materialized. And so the company that ran the ICO, which was a private entity, failed to live up to those commitments. And so the EOS community, the EOS developers, the businesses deploying on EOS, they never, and those essentially contributing to the ICO, gave up their capital with this idea that similar to what we see now with the foundation or how other chains have launched since, and they've got VCs coming in and they've got a treasury and they've got a shepherd of the ecosystem. So foundation traditionally, EOS didn't have a foundation, but this role that Block.one was expected to play and this role that they essentially committed to playing was that of a foundation. And so there is tremendous value in having one entity that can essentially help coordinate the ecosystem, not just from a financial point of view, but from a marketing brand point of view, etc. We never had that because Block.one didn't fulfill that commitment. And so you had an ecosystem that was starved of capital because they gave all of the capital away in the ICO. It didn't have access to the base level infrastructure that was being promised. That would come. And so simple things like a wallet first, or if you recall, probably the ads that you're referring to, like you said, some of it was EOS is going to launch with 1,000 apps. Well, that never occurred because that entity didn't do that. And obviously those expectations were likely unrealistic, but a lot of that was also because of the commitments they made and what they were saying. So fast forward a couple of years, when it became apparent that they would not essentially fulfill that role is when we saw that there was clearly a gap in the ecosystem. There was clearly something missing. And a lot of that surrounded, that ICO, the capital raised not being redeployed, an ecosystem void of funding, void of grant frameworks, void of a worker proposal system, things that even the community tried to stand up in the meantime, but kept being shut down by Block.one. If you do this, we're not going to deploy the capital. And so there was these threats, direct threats, some of them veiled, some very direct, that if the community stood up and tried to fill those gaps, that they would essentially prevent what was going to come. But those things never came, regardless. And that's essentially kind of what happened for that first 2.5 years or so, until the community rised up together and leveraged the tool itself, the blockchain itself, to essentially take the power back from corporate greed. And that's when the foundation was created.
How did that happen? What was leveraged to? And so first of all, perhaps, let's break it down. How did the community take the power back?
Really good question. So, this idea of when blockchain came about, if you put it back into the context of 2008, the 99% versus the 1%, this idea of having a tool that would allow communities to be able to coordinate. At the base, a big part of this technology is that having a tool that is non-centralized, that is open, that is transparent, that is immutable, that is accountable because of these inherent features, having that accessible to communities, and then knowing who's part of that community, in large part because they either have tokens or not, and you can see that on chain. The EOS community essentially leveraged that tool, the blockchain itself, the EOS network itself, to be able to make their voices known. And how did they do that? Originally, I guess the ultimate lead was, and the voices of the network that have the on-chain authority to actually do something are the block producers. And so from my point of view, during the summer of 2021, when it became apparent that the funds that were committed and promised would not be redeployed, that this was no longer subjective, and that especially the part of the code base, which that was very much black and white, where Block.one was no longer contributing to the code itself. So that was no longer subjective. You can argue, you either do it or you don't. You look in GitHub, there's either commits or they're not. When it became apparent that that was going to stop, essentially started talking to stakeholders and talking about, it's not like we were starting from scratch. We had 3 years before that of what are the problems? What are we missing? What's not happening? We had a laundry list of items. We had a laundry list. It's not like that was unknown, but all of this was, don't worry about it. Block.one is going to take care of it. And Block.one kept saying, don't worry about it. We're doing this. We're doing this. So we were already starting with something. It's not like we were starting with nothing. And so the final, the final event, so to speak, for the creation of the ENF was to get consensus on chain, was to obviously have stakeholder discussion, open discussions, discussions with the block producers, discussions with the token holders, with people operating the network, with people leveraging the network. Here's an idea. We're missing a foundation. And a lot of this was not so much that me as an individual was letting people know what I thought we were needed. It was the opposite. It was people telling us, here's what we need. Here's what we need. Somebody now just needs to do it. Ultimately leading to the block producers reaching consensus to fund this idea with a transfer of, at the time, roughly 3.5 million EOS, which was worth, give or take, $20 million at the time, to me, and with on-chain permissions and accountability, to be able to stand up this idea, to be able to basically start a foundation.
And where we are today, does Block.one still have a say in what's going on the EOS blockchain?
No. So part of the issue here underlying as well was that Block.one's public position was that they never had a say. That is completely inaccurate. Block.one publicly may have said that they didn't have a say, but there are multiple instances where Block.one in the back anyways, for example, as it relates to worker proposal systems, where if the network were to go in a direction, Block.one directly threatened to pull back funding or development, or, we're working on X project, we will no longer be able to work on X project. So as much as they want to say they didn't have any say in the network or authority over the network, whether it be funding, whether it be the tokens that they had that they were going to vote for block producers for, etc., their involvement was quite direct if you were in this ecosystem. Since then, since the creation of the foundation, Block.one essentially was fired by the network. There's no really other way to put this. When the network launched, within the code, EOS didn't have a foundation like everybody else. It didn't have a treasury like most other layer 3s when they launched. It did have 10% token allocation vesting over a period of 10 years. The idea was that over a period of 10 years, Block.one would have 10% of the network tokens being released block by block. When the foundation came in, we tried to work with Block.one. We were not able to reach terms. The block producers were not able to reach an amicable solution. So the network, through the block producers, reached consensus to essentially stop the vesting of tokens to Block.one. So all of the tokens and all of the monies that were accumulated in the ICO, those clearly were theirs. That's a private entity. They took the money and they essentially ran with it. But the on-chain portion, at least the network could stop paying them or stop releasing tokens to them. And that was effectively firing them. And so since, give or take, early December 2021, there's been no ties between Block.one and EOS. And that's been one of the biggest challenges, is that the majority of the space in general thought that the ICO funds went to EOS, but that is not the case. The developers, the community, the people building on EOS, they didn't see that capital. They didn't see any of those funds. So when the network took over, essentially needed to fund itself. It essentially needed to find a different way to be able to fill that gap, while also at the same time re-educating everybody that had expectations about EOS. Those expectations weren't met. Well, why weren't they met? You got $4.1 billion. Well, we actually didn't get $4.1 billion. That's the problem. So that part continues essentially to this day. I mean, we're talking about it right now.
And what's the current role of the EOS Network Foundation? Because, like, I feel it's also important to make a few clarifications, because a foundation, is it a central authority? Is it a company? Is it incorporated somewhere? And what's to stop the EOS Network Foundation from, doing the same stuff that Block.one did?
Excellent question. So obviously, because 3 years in, when the foundation was created, this idea of a foundation started bouncing around. We did not want to recreate what had happened for the previous 3 years. And the underlying, like if you just want a one line, the big difference is the foundation is a non-for-profit. So the foundation doesn't have shareholders. It cannot issue dividends. It has a mandate. That mandate is actually accountable on chain. Even the bylaws and the incorporating documents point back to an account on chain that we have that's called EOS prods, which is essentially the top 21 block producers. It's a dynamic permission set. So everything points back to EOS prods. So it's this idea that the foundation doesn't have any power on chain. It really doesn't. It's got no keys. It's got no block producer slots. It doesn't run node operators or anything like that. And so the foundation is really there as a shepherd or as a steward of the network. So you ask kind of what the main role is. Well, the main role is obviously protocol code development. I would say that that's the biggest one. Alongside that, being the voice of the network, being somewhat of the public face of the network. That's a big one. And then it's funded to deploy, whether it be because it's a non-for-profit, everything is for non-equity in return, but to deploy grants, to be able to do partnerships, whether it be with particular applications, third parties, to be able to bring their tools onto the network, bridges, whatever it may be. So it is that gateway, essentially. A concrete example as well, EOS just got approval 3 weeks ago from the Japanese authorities to be regulated in Japan as a token to be traded. The Japanese authorities and the regulators want one person to deal with. They want that entity that can essentially somewhat in a way speak on behalf of the network. And so that's part of the role that the foundation plays. The second part of your question, which is really good, which I kind of started to address, how do we ensure that this doesn't how do we ensure that the foundation doesn't recreate what happened with Block.one? And at the core, like I said, the fundamental difference is it's a non-for-profit. There are no shareholders. So the foundation doesn't have any fiduciary duty to anybody. The shareholders, so to speak, in a way, very broadly, are the EOS token holders. The foundation, the way that it is funded as well, is all accountable on chain. So compared to other foundations, the foundation doesn't have a treasury. We're not sitting on tokens. And so we continuously get funding from the network, and that funding mechanism has changed over the last 2 years as the foundation obviously has built trust and has grown and its function has evolved. But essentially, it's still the same, where the network, through the block producers, fund the foundation. If at any time the foundation was no longer fulfilling that role, funding would be cut. And because the foundation is a non-for-profit, it's not sitting on a treasury. It would no longer be able to operate. And so it has no choice but to continuously seek direction from the network, essentially. And we do that by some concrete things. For example, we have weekly fireside chats with the community. Anybody can participate. We've got quarterly reports where we publish all the finances. We publish the general direction of where we're going. We have monthly BP calls where any of the block producers in the top 30 positions. So even though only the top 21 actually have a vote in that EOS prods vote on chain, a formal vote, you still have more than that the block producer changes, the rankings change continuously. So we invite the top 30. We have a monthly call with them to report back on what we're doing, where we're going. Is there anything we should change? Is there anything that we're missing? Are there any areas where we should focus on more? Any areas we should focus on less? So it's a continuous discussion. And at the end of the day, if the foundation no longer fulfills the role that the token holders wish it to fulfill, funding would be cut and the foundation would die. And so the foundation has that on-chain accountability, but also that off-chain real-world accountability through its bylaws, through its mandate, being a non-for-profit located in Canada. So a lot of things were necessary to create the base or the foundations for this to really survive the test of time and not recreate what we saw previously.
Can you walk me through the process of getting changes made on the network? So I guess like the context of the question would be the EOS, the ENF, the EOS Network Foundation. It's impossible for the ENF to push updates without the network validating these updates, I assume.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, the foundation can't. So even if it wanted to, that's not a thing. So yeah, so the block producers are the ones that deploy code. The foundation is the one, though, that develops the code. So the foundation is entirely responsible for the Antelope code stack. So the Antelope code stack is the software, essentially, that powers the EOS network, as well as other networks. So it powers WAX, it powers Telos, it powers UX network, and others as well. But this is a coalition that we formed. So the foundation essentially gets direction from the block producers, from the token holders, in terms of what should we do next? What are the things that we should work on? It publishes roadmaps, whether it be on the native side or on the EVM side, for example, of what it's going to be working on for the next, give or take, 24 months, continuously updated. As the code then becomes developed, there's a process of deploying that code on test nets. And so there are block producers that are responsible for test nets. There are community members that are responsible for that. So you get the back and forth with the protocol level engineers, with the functions themselves. We hold weekly node operator calls. And so this is a continuously evolving and very open, transparent process. These node operator calls are recorded, they're published. Anybody can attend, so applications can attend, node operators can attend, stakeholders can attend. It's very open. Right. Once that code is ready, essentially, it's gone through the testing, it's gone through the releases, it's gone through the fixes, etc. We're talking about months afterwards. We're talking about this has already occurred publicly for months on end. Testing has occurred for months on end. A lot of the block producers that are running the nodes in the top 21 are also on the testnet. So they've personally been testing this software. They've been running this software. And ultimately, depending on the type of upgrade, whether it be what we call, I guess, what the rest of the world calls more of a soft upgrade, which is it doesn't require all 21 to update, or all nodes on the network, let's say, not just the 21 to update. But it does require, let's say, 15 out of 21, which is a majority consensus, to deploy. There's a process for that. If it's something that's a little bit more that's for a hard breaking change. If it's a soft breaking change, people update at their own pace. So whether they update now, whether they update in 6 months, whether they never update, we've got some of those type of code pushes, and that typically occurs in the spring release. In the fall release, it is typically breaking changes, which means it requires 15 out of 21 to deploy this new code, but it doesn't necessarily require everybody on the network. Any application running, any API, whatever, some of them don't require everybody. So that's one level of change that we see. And then the highest level of change, which what we call a hard fork, requires everybody to update, everybody to make those updates. That requires a lot of obviously a lot of coordination and such, but this type of thing is ever ongoing. So there's not real one answer, as much as it's a lot of different moving parts over a very lengthy period of time.
Right. So basically what I wanted to come to was that the ENF doesn't hold any specific authority, and it's pretty much unable to push anything without the approval of the network itself. Okay. And
it is possible that, for example, the ENF releases a new version of Antelope and that the networks choose not to deploy it, not to implement it. That is entirely possible. It would be odd, because in order to be able to deploy software, we're talking about, let's say, a year's worth of work where the node operators have been involved and they've requested these changes, but it is entirely possible. Correct. The ENF doesn't have any authority on chain.
Okay, and let's get talking about the past. What are you guys working on right now? Like, what is the coolest thing that you're working right now?
The next big thing that we're working kind of builds off of things that we've just deployed this year. So at the base this year, we became EVM compatible. So early on in October, we released our EVM compatibility smart contracts, and that's really opened doors. So now, from an EOS engine point of view, we've got the native side and we've got the EVM side. So that's been very, very exciting.
Sorry, excuse me for the interruption, but can you please just elify what is EVM compatibility? Because I'm sure it's something that's been discussed and it's in every article, but I'm sure some people still don't know what it is. So just to make sure.
Sure. So basically EVM stands for Ethereum Virtual Machine. It's this idea that at the base, Ethereum has created tremendous resources, libraries, audited code. It's got access to a lot of applications, of liquidity, of developers. It's a whole ecosystem, right? The Ethereum ecosystem. And many chains, including EOS now, have created essentially kind of this bridge, which is called EVM, which enables the native chain, in our case, EOS, to be able to communicate with Ethereum in a way. Right. So if you're an Ethereum developer, so you're a Solidity developer, and you've deployed an application on Ethereum, and you either are facing scalability challenges and or financial unpredictability challenges. What I mean by that is rising gas costs or unpredictable gas costs, and that's creating challenges for your particular business or application. Or if you just simply want to access new communities, new liquidity, you want to open up basically the thing that you have, the application typically, to different communities, different chains. EVM is that layer essentially. What it does is that you do not need to reconfigure your application and change your code. I'm oversimplifying, but you essentially kind of just double click and now you're on a new chain. And for your users at the end, the ultimate users at the end, they don't see any difference. So if they're used to, let's say, connecting to MetaMask to connect to your application, now they would still connect to MetaMask. It's a different API. It'll point to EOS's EVM API. But now you get the power of EOS in the background as the engine without necessarily having the costs of what Ethereum bears. So gas costs, negligible, number of users, number of accounts, number of transactions per second, everything is amplified. So that's the EVM side of things. And we deployed that in April. And the simplest way to put it is it opens doors. It opens doors to new developers, to new communities, and it really bridges the gap between different chains. And that's very exciting.
So that's
on the native side.
Yeah.
So on the native side of things, we deployed earlier this year something that the UX network engineers have been working on for years called IBC, so inter blockchain communication. And this is the idea that EOS as a software stack, let's say as a network, our approach to scalability is that EOS as a one instance running is extremely performant, highly scalable. It's the only blockchain that's ever done more than 100 million transactions per second, sustained for months. To put that in context, I believe number 2 is Wax, that also runs the same software stack, and they average between, I think, 25 to 35 million per day. 125 million transactions per day is more than all of the other blockchains combined. It's more than Bitcoin and Ethereum for an entire year in every single day. So EOS is extremely scalable as one instance. Having said that, though, if we look at real world applications of Web 2, that's still nothing, right? If we look at games, let's say on blockchain right now with 5,000, 10,000 daily active users, that is nothing compared to even a rank 10,000 game in a mobile store on the Apple Store or something like that, right? It's a joke. We're nowhere near there. So as much as EOS currently in its form is extremely scalable, extremely reliable, predictable, in order to be able to meet the inevitable demand, if you believe that this technology is essentially going to be reach mainstream adoption at some point, you need to scale way beyond anything anybody can do right now. And so our approach to it is very similar to when I'm a hardware guy, so please bear with me, when CPUs in a computer went from single core to dual core. And so this idea that now in the same thing, you now have 2 cores that can work in parallel. The application or what's accessing it doesn't care whether there's 2 in the background or not, actually can benefit from 2. So it's horizontal scalability. So with IBC, what we've done with EOS is that now 2 Antelope iterations can speak to one another, not in a parent-child relationship, but really in a sibling relationship. Both are equal. There's not one that's above the other. They're very much equal. The parent-child relationship is also possible, and that would be the equivalent of, again, going back to this analogy of hardware, hyper-threading. So hyper-threading in a core is not necessarily another core, it's just that you're splitting that core and making certain parts of it more accessible. So anyways, I'm generalizing here for the audience. One of the issues that we have with current IBC is that finality on EOS is roughly 3 minutes. So you've got your block times at 0.5 seconds. So the blocks on the one instance move incredibly fast. EOS is very, very rapid. But to reach finality is about 3 minutes. So if you've got two instances speaking to one another, and you want to communicate between both because one is no longer suitable to be able to scale to whatever demand is being asked, you'd have to wait 3 minutes on one side, 3 minutes on the other side for this trustless communication to occur, essentially. 6 minutes in between, not realistic if you actually want to run an application in real time. And we're talking about more supply than there is currently any demand. One instance of Antelope right now, the EOS network, for example, has way more supply than there is any demand right now. We're not there yet. But if this idea that at some point you're going to have that demand, we're working on that infinite scalability. So you've got these two. The next thing that we're working on right now, which will be the next hard fork, is instant finality. So EOS is changing consensus algorithm, going away from DPoS to what essentially a variation of hot stuff being what the Facebook Libre chain was had been working on. I believe it's what Sui is currently running on as well with Miston Labs as the main developers. We're moving towards a variation of that, whereby now the finality between on one chain will be roughly 1 to 3 seconds. So if you now join these two, you've got, let's say, 2 to 5 seconds in between for these to communicate. Now we're talking about potential infinite scalability. So you'd be able to create as many instances as you want, and they can speak in a trustless fashion, no bridge, no third party in between one another, essentially infinitely scaling out the potential resources that are made accessible, whether it be CPU for processing time on chain, whether it be RAM for account creation, storing data on chain, etc. Now you open that up. So that's what we're working on. That's extremely exciting because it takes this idea that EOS already is the most performing blockchain and opens that up to now it's infinite. Now this dream of one of the things that brought me to EOS 5 years ago of 1 million transactions per second, kind of as a benchmark, is actually possible. It is real. It's already coming.
Okay. And you talked about this demand coming. Do you think, I mean, you obviously think it will come, but where do you think it will come from?
So I hope it comes. I mean, I hope that you also believe it comes. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I'm not sure what we're doing.
doing.
But yeah, so whether it'll come now in 1 year, whether it'll come in 10 years, that we don't know. But inevitably, I do believe it's going to come. And where I believe it's going to come from, I think that one of the entry points inevitably is going to be gaming. I think that gamers in general understand digital assets very well. The barrier to entry for them to understand digital assets, in-game currencies, etc. It's not an issue for them. They already understand this. The gaming market as a whole is tremendous. It's huge. It has a lot of players, and we've only seen with time that that's increased. So the percentage, I saw stats not too long ago, of gamers, daily gamers from the millennial generation was roughly 84%. But when you went to, what's the next one, Gen Z, I think it shot up to 90 or 91%. And now with, I think Generation Alpha is the new term, people born after 2010 or something like that, the percentage is something like 94%. So gaming as an industry essentially touches almost everybody. Most people like games. And so I believe that because gamers inherently understand digital assets, because most people in general are gamers, that there's a tremendous business around gaming. So there's obviously money to be made. There's an ecosystem. There's revenue generating possibilities. That will likely be one of the entry points for mass adoption. But in order for that to happen, as an industry, there are a lot of things that we need to work on. So for one, is still abstracting away that blockchain layer. A gamer on the back end, the majority of the people, I believe, won't care whether it's on blockchain or not. They just want to access a game. They want to play a game. The game needs to be fun. And the game needs to be attractive. If on top of that, you get the inherent benefits of blockchain, that's just a bonus. What we've seen so far in blockchain gaming, I think, is the reverse. We've had people come in because of blockchain, we've had people come in because of the potential financial properties or the tokenomic properties, but the games themselves have not been very fun. And so when the finances dry out, the gamers leave. So we're not there yet.
Yeah, they're not treating it like a game. They're treating it like a job, basically, just another way to make money, right?
Correct.
Because,
But
like,
that is useful. But that's not, I think, what's going to reach mass adoption. So you need that in order to be able to generate revenue, to attract more people, to be able to build more games, and kind of create that cycle. But I don't think we've reached, or we have not reached the tipping point yet where something is so attractive, so fun, low barrier to entry, just happens to be on blockchain.
right.
We've not reached that yet.
Yeah. So I'm a gamer myself. Like I've always gamed, even professionally at one point. But
nice.
The thing is,
which game did you play professionally? I'm kind of interested.
Counter-Strike 1.6.
Nice.
Yeah. So
all right.
Okay. It was back in 2000 and I'd like to say 6 or something like that. Yeah, that's when I played CS, and then I discovered World of Warcraft, and my social life disappeared for the next 15 years, pretty much. Yeah, yeah.
Gotcha,
And it's funny. It's funny because that quote from Vitalik about how he was playing his warlock and he was casting a spell, and then the other day Blizzard wanted to nerf that spell. It resonated so much with me. Yeah, because. Yeah, that concept itself is really, really cool. But you mentioned something really interesting. Like, as a gamer, I don't care if the game is built on a blockchain network or they're using some other engine, whatever. I don't care about that. I just want to have fun, to spend some time playing the game. And if at the end of the day, I get to own my stuff, and that's just cool. But as you said, the approach so far has been different. I haven't come across a game which was built around the actual gameplay rather than the tokenomics of the and back in 2021 I was looking into a lot of games because the entire industry was centered around P2E, right? So I had to research a lot of, and none of them were actually paying attention to the actual gameplay, which, come on, it's a game.
It's also very early. So obviously the people that are willing to take the risk to invest time and resources want to minimize that risk. And so the financial aspect is core to it. So I think it's inevitable, and it's a stepping stone that we must go through in order to be able to reach something where now, there are architectural blueprints of how to deploy games, how to leverage blockchain, which parts do you leverage, not necessarily everything. That's what we're building right now. That's what we're seeing occur right now. Obviously, those are pain points. But I think it is necessary to ultimately get to, now we've got games that in the back end leverage blockchain functionalities, but that's not what's at the forefront, that's abstracted away from gamers.
Right. Okay, so I came across a video of yours from Paris, PBWS. You said that the theme of that conference was interoperability. And before we started our recording, you mentioned that you were on a 2-week trip in Asia. You visited a lot of conferences over there. What would you say the themes were at these conferences?
The main one I would say was RWAs. And so real world assets. And I guess in part because of regulation changes that we're seeing throughout the world, and challenges that we've had, I guess, in the last year and a half or so in this ecosystem. So there's definitely been a shift. While I was in Paris, there was a lot of talk of gaming and how this summer essentially would be GameFi summer. I've even mentioned that on multiple occasions. The market hasn't really, in my opinion anyways, showcased that very much. We're still very much in a sideways / bear market, which makes it very difficult for new entrants to come in. We've seen a lot of tremendous development on the infrastructure front to be able to enable more users, more gaming, more interoperability. So that's occurred. I'm seeing that very much. But the topic of discussion has shifted a lot to RWAs, to ZK snarks, liquid staking. I think those are maybe the three, but the predominant one by far that I was hearing was RWAs.
And how does EOS fit in that?
So in order to be able to have real world assets, you need frameworks, you need permission sets that are inherent on chain, you need reliability, you need security, you need predictability of cost. So one of the things we see with blockchains that tout high performance is that it is true, they're highly performant. And in some of them, they also say we're highly performant and we're low cost, which is great. If you want to deploy a business or if you want to run assets on chain and you want to open that up for all the benefits that blockchain can provide, having a lot of performance to be able to essentially accommodate the demand and having low cost is important. But if your low cost is not also paired with predictability, that is a big challenge, because today your business cost will be X, tomorrow they might be 2X or 3X, even though we're talking about perhaps low cost. Once you multiply that by the amount of demand that we're talking about, because if we're talking about RWAs or more mass adoption type of applications, now we're talking about very low cost or low value transactions, but a whole lot of them. And so even a slight incremental change in price dynamics makes a huge bottom line impact to the businesses leveraging the blockchain. And so that third component, predictability, is incredibly important, paired with that low cost. And this is where EOS is really poised to meet that demand as it inevitably, I believe, will come. EOS, as I mentioned earlier, can provide so much supply, but it does so with cost predictability. To give a concrete example, applications that are running on EOS right now that are managing 30 to 50,000 DAUs per day, their resource cost to be able to operate is negligible. We're talking about businesses that generate millions of dollars per month in revenue, where their resource cost, essentially the idea of the gas cost or something, which they can abstract away from their users because EOS enables that. So users never see gas fees, users never see, they just interact with the application. They never have to interact with resources on chain. The application, though, does have to pay for their resources because inevitably there's a cost on the network. But those costs are so negligible. In this example of 30 to 50,000 DAU, we've got applications generating millions of dollars per month, and their revenue allocated to resource management is less than $1,000 per month. It is negligible. So you're able to, and it's predictable. So they know that every month they allocate $500 a month for resources, and they can accommodate 1 million users per month or whatever their active user number is. And so that for us is a huge advantage. To put it back to gaming as an example, if you look at what we've seen so far in the last couple of years, we've seen very high value NFTs or high value digital assets. And so when you've got a high value digital asset, let's say it's worth $10,000, $1 million, you don't necessarily care if it's a $50 transaction, $100 transaction.
Right.
But the reality is most digital assets will not be $1 million assets. They'll be 5-cent assets, 2-cent assets. Look at Steam Store, for example. The majority of in-game items are negligible, non-value items. And so if you want to be able to accommodate for that, you need a blockchain that can accommodate extreme high throughput, negligible cost, so that you don't take away from that potential, profit margin that exists. And really, EOS is built for that. EOS as an operating system is built for that. It's built to be able to handle all these applications. And as I mentioned earlier, as you have more demand, EOS is also built so that it can essentially horizontally scale infinitely. That is what we keep working on, because we believe at some point there's going to be inevitable demand, and we want to be there to be able to provide that supply.
So what's the downside? What arguments can be made about the downside of it? Because it sounds like you guys have kind of solved the blockchain trilemma, but is that so, or is there an
I wouldn't
argument
say no. So I wouldn't say that we've solved the blockchain trilemma. Part of the blockchain trilemma is centralization versus decentralization.
Right.
And to me, that's not a on or off. You're not either centralized or decentralized. It's a spectrum, and it's a spectrum along multiple lines within your business. So whether it be at the node level, whether it be at the API level, whether it be at the token holder level, the distribution of token holders, whether it be at the who develops the code, etc. Right? So each of these aspects has a varying degree of centralization and decentralization. EOS, in its approach at the node operator level, has chosen a model that is more centralized, let's say, than Bitcoin. There are 21 nodes that are elected, and these rankings change every 0.5 seconds, and they've changed. If you map that out over the years, they've changed drastically, and they keep on changing and evolving. Because they only have 21, though, at any given time, it is more centralized than Bitcoin. Now, there are 500 in line to be those 21 spots, but at any given time, there's only 21. And so that creates a lot of efficiencies. But it's also, I guess, a downside if you're looking at ultimate security and you don't want any level of centralization and you want, millions and millions of nodes. What we see in reality, though, as we started talking earlier, is that even though in Bitcoin it's possible to have a million different people contributing, the reality is there's really only 3 or 4 mining pools that essentially aggregate all of that. We see that with Ethereum 2.0 as well right now, with, I believe it's now 30 or 33% of the mining power held within one entity, right? So it inevitably centralizes, but it's a different approach at the base. From a code production point of view, from the protocol point of view right now, or protocol code point of view, it is quite centralized. It's centralized within the ENF. The inputs are decentralized, but the production itself is very centralized. And so you create efficiencies there. In terms of the language used for code as well, EOS went with C++. C++ is widely used language. It's a very old language, a very performant language. But one of the downsides to that is to be proficient in C++ is actually very, very difficult. And so anybody can learn C++, but to be really good at C++ takes a lot of time, versus going a different route like Go or Rust. The barrier to entry probably lower, but then you also reach limits in terms of scalability for the performance of the language itself. So EOS went and I guess took some directions on what it would implement in terms of language, in terms of architecture, in terms of the number of block producers, the foundation. All of these things end up being this hyper-performant solution. But at any point here, you could argue this is good or bad, and yeah. So that I don't think there's necessarily one answer of what's good or what's bad. It's a particular flavor that has focused on hyper scalability, and other networks have focused on providing a different value offering. Let's say. So I believe that something like Bitcoin will inevitably have its place. I treat it as, kind of my, not the savings account, but the one where I don't really touch. It's there. It doesn't move. I don't necessarily want to operate on it as much as possible. I just want to park it. I want to park the capital. Right. I want to park the Bitcoin. I don't want to touch it. But if I want to interact with blockchain day to day, I'm not going to interact with Bitcoin day to day, but I would interact as an application developer with EOS day to day, which then through EVM can connect to Ethereum and unlock that, or through other bridges that we're working inevitably or ultimately connect to other blockchains. So I see that's the role of EOS, is that application layer, that operating system. Think about it like it's the Windows or it's the Mac OS type of thing. That's what you interact with on a daily basis, is what we're positioning ourselves to be.
And what are your biggest challenges? Like, what's the thing that you're first, what are your plans for the future, and thereby what are the challenges to get there?
Inevitably, one of the challenges right now in this market is the token price itself. I mean, as the foundation, we receive inflation from the network. And so as the token price goes up or down, our budget drastically changes. And so that's an ongoing challenge. We've inherited a piece of software stack. We've forked it, we've rebranded it, we've made a lot of improvements to it. So the software and the tech itself is great. But what we didn't have and what we're trying to play catch up on is the marketing, the branding, and the lost time for about 3.5 years where other players entered the industry and they did really good at that. So the way I put it is some of these other Gen 3 layer 1 blockchains that are high in ranking and seem to attract a lot of eyes and attention right now, their challenges are on the tech front. So they're having a really hard time keeping the network up and running, having it stable. I mean, there's some jokes of some networks are open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday type of thing, right? So their challenges are on the tech front. But what they did really good at is the funding, the branding, the marketing, this side of things. In our case, the tech is incredibly strong. The network's been up and running for more than 5 years, literally zero downtime, 100% uptime. So we don't have the technical challenge is in that sense. One of the challenges right now is we actually provide too much supply and there's not enough demand. So, it's an inherent property that we have. Our challenge is more in the marketing, the branding, making sure that the eyes come back on the network, having fallen, let's say, from grace, having had all these expectations not being met, the community taking over and trying to get back mind share. That's our main challenge in that sense.
How do you go about it?
Day to day, wake up one day at a time. I mean, obviously spreading the word, spreading education, signing more and more deals, getting more applications launching on the network, seeing those numbers of developers contributing to code increase, obviously interacting with community, because at the base, everything is about community. You can go at this alone, you're never going to be as efficient as if you've got an army of people that also believe in the same future. So, that's a key component to that. We just talked about being in Asia or being in Paris earlier this year, being on the ground, talking to people, finding out what their challenges are, how we can address them. We have more and more applications launching on chain through the EVM, for example, lately, deploying their products, bringing in more users, seeing the power that the engine, let's say the EOS engine can provide, being able to showcase that more and more. It's an everyday, one thing at a time process. Positioning ourselves for what I hope will be a next bull, which then, because EOS didn't benefit from the last 2 bulls, it didn't have a team behind it that was able to, during the bear, essentially work and position itself for the next upturn. That's our focus right now, to make sure that we're ready, so that when the next bull comes, and there's typically a lot of new users, a lot of new applicants, developers, stakeholders that come, that EOS is now again a viable solution that people choose to deploy on and interact with.
And this is perhaps my last question, but when you go on conferences, when you talk to people, do you find out that people still hold some of the previous beliefs about EOS, or are they aware of the cool stuff that you guys are working on, and that there is no longer a central authority behind it? And
it's quite mixed. I mean, you get some people that discounted EOS years ago, that either they participate in the ICO or they know somebody who participated in the ICO and then didn't hear anything afterwards, or saw the token price go down, or they didn't really hear of much development, etc. And they've essentially discounted EOS, and because there's so many projects in this ecosystem, their attention, their focus has shifted elsewhere, and so they've just not paid attention. Just like we look externally, we look at other networks, but there's so many out there, you can't know what everybody's doing. You have a limited amount of attention span. So we get people that just don't know what's been going on, and so the conversation starts from the very beginning. We then get some people that have been following along, and they're extremely excited about what they're seeing, because they see EOS as an undervalued asset. They see EOS as one of those players that has a chance to do what nobody else has done before, which is essentially go from being in grace to falling out of ranks to coming back up, which is obviously what we're attempting to do. And they want to get behind that. They like that story. They like that narrative. They see that there's underlying fundamentals that are incredibly strong, and they see the opportunity, and they're looking to get in at the ground floor to be able to benefit from this opportunity, essentially. So they're seeing kind of a diamond in the rough type of thing. So we get both extremes, but we're definitely seeing more and more people, and this has been a trend now for the last year and a half or so, where people are seeing that this is a diamond in the rough, and people are accumulating tokens. They're accumulating large positions to be able to benefit from that when the new bull comes.
Well, thank you so much, Yves, for this. I think it's been a blast. Can you tell us where we can find you? And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your Twitter handle.
Awesome. So my Twitter handle is Big Beard Samurai, as is apparent. It's actually a name that was given to me by the community. We have a very large Chinese community in EOS, and a year or so ago, they a little bit more than that now, they started calling me Big Beard. And so Big Beard Samurai, all in one word. Same for Telegram. So at Big Beard Samurai, Telegram at Twitter at Big Beard Samurai, and or on our website. So at www.eosnetwork.com. And on there, you can find a lot of blogs, a lot of articles, a lot of videos, audio, whatever it may be. You'll have all your resources, whether you're a developer, token holder, whatever kind of stakeholder you are, then the website will give you the information you're looking for.
Well, thank you once again for this.
Well, thank you very much, George. This was a blast.